Elena Castellano stood at the granite kitchen island, carefully arranging financial reports and presentation materials that had consumed her entire weekend. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Malibu home, casting golden light across spreadsheets that would determine whether Pinnacle Technologies secured their biggest client contract to date. Every calculation, every projection, every strategic recommendation bore the invisible fingerprints of her analytical mind. Richard burst through the kitchen doors, adjusting his Italian silk tie with the practiced efficiency of a man who had never questioned his own importance. He grabbed the portfolio Elena had prepared, barely glancing at her meticulous work before stuffing it into his briefcase. Elena cleared her throat softly and gestured toward the presentation materials. She had noticed a critical error in the quarterly projections that could cost them the Morrison account, worth $12 million annually. The numbers in Section 4 needed immediate correction before the 9 o'clock meeting. Richard waved his hand dismissively without looking up from his phone. "Don't worry about things you don't understand," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescending patience. "You focus on keeping the house running since you don't contribute financially to this family. Leave the real business decisions to people who actually understand how companies work." The words hit Elena like they always did, a calculated cruelty designed to diminish her worth to that of an expensive household appliance. But she said nothing, simply watching as her husband grabbed his coffee and headed toward the garage, completely oblivious to the fact that his success depended entirely on work she performed in shadows. Before we continue with this story of hidden power and ultimate revenge, I'm curious about where you're watching from today. Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're tuning in from. It's amazing how these stories of workplace dynamics and relationship power struggles seem to resonate with viewers everywhere. As Richard's Porsche disappeared down their winding driveway, Elena allowed herself a moment to remember how different things had been 5 years ago. She had been Elena Martinez then, a senior financial analyst at Morrison Holdings, earning 6 figures while managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions. Her corner office had commanded respect from colleagues who sought her expertise on complex merger negotiations and international investment strategies. The day Richard pitched his startup idea over lunch at that downtown bistro seemed like a lifetime ago now. His vision for Pinnacle Technologies had been compelling, certainly, but the business plan he presented had been riddled with fundamental flaws that would have guaranteed failure within 18 months. Elena had spent 3 weeks of evenings secretly reworking his entire financial model, restructuring his approach to venture capital acquisition, and developing sustainable growth projections that actually made sense. When Richard received his first round of funding, he never mentioned that Elena had essentially rewritten his entire business proposal. When investors praised his sophisticated understanding of market dynamics, he never credited the woman who had taught him the difference between gross and net profit margins. And when he asked her to leave her lucrative position to help him build the company from the ground up, he somehow forgot to mention that her name would never appear on any official documentation. Elena had believed in their partnership then, convinced that building something together would strengthen their relationship and create shared success. She had liquidated her retirement accounts, cashed out her stock options, and invested every penny into Richard's dream while taking the title of unpaid administrative assistant. The irony wasn't lost on her now, 6 years later, as she cleaned up messes created by the man who regularly reminded her of her unemployed status. The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway interrupted her thoughts. Richard's business associates were arriving for their monthly strategy dinner, another evening where Elena would serve elaborate meals while listening to her husband take credit for initiatives she had developed. She smoothed her dress, checked the dining room table settings one final time, and prepared to become invisible once again. Marcus Webb and Stephen Chun entered the house with the confident swagger of men who had never questioned their right to occupy space. Richard led them into the living room, already launching into animated discussion about the Morrison contract presentation. Elena appeared with a tray of imported wine and artisanal appetizers, moving efficiently between the men as they sprawled across the leather furniture. Richard gestured vaguely in her direction while continuing his conversation. "This is Elena, my wife," he said without pausing his analysis of market penetration strategies. She keeps the house running while I handle the business side of things. Marcus barely acknowledged her presence, too focused on Richard's explanation of their competitive advantages in the government contracting sector. Stephen offered a polite nod before diving back into discussion of their expansion timeline. Neither man had any idea that the woman serving their wine had designed the entire expansion strategy they were debating. Elena retreated to the kitchen, listening through the open doorway as Richard presented ideas she had spent weeks developing. His confidence was intoxicating, his presentation skills undeniably impressive, but every insight he shared originated from late-night research sessions Elena conducted while he slept peacefully upstairs. The Morrison account strategy that Richard described with such authority had been Elena's creation from start to finish. She had identified their vulnerability in the federal compliance sector, developed the service package that would address their specific needs, and calculated the pricing structure that would undercut their current provider while maintaining healthy profit margins. Richard's role had been limited to reading her recommendations and delivering them with conviction. As the evening progressed, Elena continued serving courses while listening to Richard weave elaborate narratives around her work. When Stephen praised his innovative approach to client retention, Richard accepted the compliments gracefully, never mentioning the comprehensive client satisfaction analysis Elena had compiled. When Marcus expressed amazement at Richard's grasp of regulatory compliance issues, Richard spoke eloquently about expertise gained through careful study of documentation Elena had researched and summarized. After the guests departed, Elena cleaned the kitchen while Richard lounged in his office, already planning how he would present tomorrow's materials. She could hear him on the phone with his assistant, discussing scheduling and logistics for the week ahead, completely unaware that the woman washing his dishes had spent her evening mentally noting 3 additional errors in his Morrison proposal. Elena dried the last wine glass and placed it carefully in the cabinet before retrieving her laptop from its hiding place behind the cookbook collection. The household might be asleep, but her real work was just beginning. She had emails to send, financial models to refine, and client communications to manage, all under the cover of darkness that had become her professional reality. Her fingers moved efficiently across the keyboard as she corrected Richard's mistakes, refined his talking points, and prepared the supplementary materials that would ensure tomorrow's presentation succeeded despite his limitations. This had become her existence, the shadow figure behind every achievement Richard claimed as his own. By 2 in the morning, Elena had transformed Richard's mediocre presentation into a comprehensive proposal that Morrison Holdings couldn't possibly refuse. She printed the revised documents, placed them strategically where Richard would find them in the morning, and erased all digital traces of her contributions. As she finally climbed the stairs to bed, Elena caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. 5 years of invisible labor had changed her in ways that went deeper than the fine lines around her eyes or the silver threads beginning to appear in her dark hair. She had become a ghost in her own life, a woman whose intelligence and expertise existed only in the spaces between other people's recognition. Tomorrow Richard would deliver her presentation, accept praise for her insights, and return home to remind her once again that she contributed nothing of value to their household. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of their Malibu home, Elena allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be powerful. The Pinnacle Technologies annual investor gala transformed the Beverly Hills Hilton Ballroom into a showcase of corporate success and barely contained ambition. Crystal chandeliers cast elegant light across tables where venture capitalists, industry leaders, and potential clients mingled over champagne and carefully orchestrated conversations about market opportunities and strategic partnerships. Elena stood beside Richard near the main presentation area, wearing the black cocktail dress he had selected for her earlier that evening. He had insisted she attend tonight, not as his business partner or intellectual equal, but as an attractive accessory to complement his image of domestic stability and traditional success. Richard held court with a group of potential investors, his voice carrying across the immediate area as he gestured dramatically while describing Pinnacle's meteoric growth trajectory. Elena recognized every statistic he quoted, every growth projection he cited, every strategic insight he claimed as his own revolutionary thinking. Marcus Webb approached their circle with Stephen Chun and 2 men Elena didn't recognize, both wearing expensive suits and the confident expressions of people accustomed to writing significant checks. Richard immediately shifted into his most charismatic mode, extending his hand with practiced enthusiasm. "Gentlemen," Richard announced, "I'd like you to meet my wife Elena. She keeps our home life running smoothly while I focus on building the business." Elena smiled politely and nodded as Richard continued his introduction. "She doesn't really understand the technical side of what we do, but she's fantastic at hosting dinner parties and keeping me organized." The investors chuckled appreciatively at Richard's casual dismissal, clearly comfortable with traditional dynamics where successful men maintained decorative wives who posed no threat to their professional dominance. Elena had learned to absorb these moments without visible reaction, though each dismissal carved another small wound in her sense of self-worth. Jonathan Morrison himself materialized beside their group, the silver-haired CEO whose company represented Pinnacle's most valuable potential contract. Richard's eyes lit up with barely concealed excitement as he launched into his carefully rehearsed pitch about synergistic opportunities and revolutionary service delivery models. Elena listened with growing alarm as Richard confidently quoted financial projections that were completely incorrect. The numbers he cited for implementation costs were off by nearly 30%, a miscalculation that would either price them out of contention or commit them to delivering services at an unsustainable loss. She recognized the error immediately as one she had flagged in her review notes, corrections that Richard had apparently ignored while preparing his presentation materials. Morrison's expression shifted subtly as Richard continued digging himself deeper into mathematical impossibility. The seasoned executive had built his fortune by recognizing when numbers didn't add up, and Richard's enthusiastic but fundamentally flawed projections were setting off every alarm bell in Morrison's analytical mind. Elena found herself in an impossible position. Remaining silent would allow Richard to destroy their most important business relationship, but speaking up would humiliate him publicly and likely trigger explosive retaliation later. She chose a middle path, gently touching Richard's arm and suggesting they might want to double-check those specific figures before making any formal commitments. Richard's response was swift and cutting. "Elena, honey, why don't you go refresh your wine and let the adults handle the business discussion? You know numbers have never been your strong suit." He turned back to Morrison with an apologetic smile. "Women, right? They mean well, but they don't really grasp the complexities of corporate finance." Morrison's eyebrows raised slightly at Richard's casual dismissal, but Elena saw her opportunity in his momentary hesitation. She excused herself from the group and discreetly moved to Richard's briefcase, retrieving the corrected financial projections she had prepared as backup documentation. When she returned, she quietly slipped the revised numbers to Morrison while Richard continued his oblivious presentation. Morrison glanced at the corrected figures, his expression immediately shifting from skeptical concern to genuine interest. The numbers Elena had provided told a completely different story, one that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of market dynamics and realistic implementation timelines. Without acknowledging Elena's intervention, Morrison began asking pointed questions based on the accurate projections rather than Richard's flawed presentation. Richard, suddenly finding himself discussing numbers that didn't match his prepared remarks, stumbled through increasingly confused responses until Elena discreetly showed him the corrected documents. His relief was palpable as he seamlessly transitioned to presenting Elena's work as his own careful analysis, never acknowledging that his initial calculations had been dangerously wrong. Morrison concluded the conversation by expressing strong interest in moving forward with formal negotiations, praising Richard's thorough preparation and sophisticated financial modeling. As the CEO walked away, Richard practically glowed with self-satisfaction, completely unaware that Elena's quick thinking had just saved him from professional catastrophe. "You got lucky that time," Richard whispered to Elena as the investors dispersed. "But this is exactly why you should leave the thinking to professionals who actually understand how business works. I don't know what made you think you could contribute to a conversation about corporate strategy." Elena nodded silently, watching Richard accept congratulations from colleagues who assumed he had impressed Morrison through his own competence. She excused herself to visit the restroom, needing a moment alone to process the surreal experience of watching someone else receive credit for saving their own career. In the marble-appointed lady's room, Elena caught her reflection in the ornate mirror and saw a woman who had become expert at making herself invisible. 5 years of marriage to Richard had taught her to hide her intelligence, minimize her contributions, and accept public humiliation as the price of maintaining their household's financial stability. When she returned to the ballroom, Richard was deep in conversation with David Kim, Pinnacle's head of business development, discussing their strategy for managing major client relationships. Elena knew this conversation intimately because she had been conducting most of the actual client management work for the past 2 years, maintaining relationships through carefully crafted emails, detailed status reports, and strategic communication that Richard had no idea was happening. David mentioned some concerns about client retention metrics, specifically noting that their satisfaction scores had improved dramatically over the past 18 months despite increased competition in their sector. Richard nodded sagely and launched into an explanation of his innovative approach to customer relationship management, describing strategies that Elena had developed and implemented entirely behind the scenes. Elena listened as Richard took credit for her systematic outreach program, her quarterly satisfaction surveys, her proactive problem resolution protocols, and her comprehensive client preference database. Every initiative he described as his own revolutionary thinking represented hours of Elena's unpaid labor, work she performed after Richard fell asleep each night. The most painful moment came when David specifically praised Richard's personal touch in client communications, mentioning how several major accounts had commented on the thoughtful, detailed service they received. Richard accepted the compliments graciously, never mentioning that Elena crafted every email, prepared every status update, and managed every relationship that David was praising. As the evening wound down, Richard found Elena near the coat check and announced his decision to hire a real executive assistant to help manage his increasing responsibilities. He explained that while Elena meant well, she simply wasn't qualified to handle the sophisticated administrative work that his growing success required. "Elena," he said with the patient tone one might use with a child, "I appreciate how you try to help, but I need someone with actual business experience who can keep up with the demands of running a major company. You're wonderful at the home front, but I need professional support for professional challenges." The irony was so profound that Elena almost laughed out loud. Richard was essentially firing her from performing work she had never been officially hired to do, work that had made his entire career possible, work that he didn't even realize was happening under his own roof. They drove home in Richard's Porsche through the winding roads of Beverly Hills, Richard energetically recounting his conversational victories and business prospects, while Elena stared out the passenger window at the glittering lights of Los Angeles sprawling below them. He had no idea that his success tonight depended entirely on her quick thinking, her analytical skills, and her comprehensive understanding of their business operations. Back home in their Malibu house, Richard poured himself a celebratory scotch and began making notes about follow-up strategies for the contacts he had made tonight. Elena excused herself to check messages, retreating to the kitchen where she kept her personal phone hidden behind the coffee maker. She had 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, along with a voicemail message that made her heart race with unexpected possibility. The voice belonged to Margaret Chun, a corporate attorney whose name Elena recognized from various legal documents she had reviewed over the years. "Ms. Castellano," the message began, "I represent certain interests regarding Pinnacle Technologies and need to discuss some urgent matters with you regarding tomorrow's board meeting. Please call me back tonight regardless of the hour. There are some things you need to know about your legal position that may come as quite a surprise." Elena stared at her phone in confusion. She wasn't aware of any scheduled board meeting, and she certainly couldn't understand why a corporate attorney would need to speak with the unemployed wife of Pinnacle's CEO. Margaret Chin's voice had carried an urgency that suggested whatever she needed to discuss couldn't wait until normal business hours. Richard's laughter echoed from the living room where he was already planning his next career moves, completely unaware that his wife had just received a phone call that would change everything he thought he knew about power, control, and ownership. Elena looked toward the sound of his voice, then back at her phone, sensing that tomorrow would bring revelations that would shatter the carefully constructed illusion of their marriage. She quietly dialed Margaret Chin's number, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to learn what urgent legal matters could possibly involve Richard's unemployed wife. The attorney answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting beside her phone for Elena's response. What Margaret Chin told her during that whispered conversation would transform Elena from invisible housewife to corporate power player overnight. Armed with legal documentation that Richard had never bothered to read carefully and financial control he had never realized he didn't possess. Richard approached the Pinnacle Technologies building on Monday morning with the confident stride of a man riding high on weekend victories and impending business success. The Morrison contract negotiation was scheduled for Thursday, and he had already begun mentally spending the seven-figure commission that would cement his reputation as one of Los Angeles's most successful tech entrepreneurs. He swiped his executive access card at the main entrance and waited for the familiar green light that would admit him to his corporate kingdom. Instead, the scanner flashed red and emitted a sharp denial beep that echoed through the marble lobby. Richard frowned and tried again, assuming the reader had malfunctioned or needed cleaning. Red light. Denial beep. The security guard behind the reception desk looked up with barely concealed amusement, clearly enjoying whatever drama was about to unfold. Richard approached the desk with growing irritation, holding up his access card like evidence of wrongful persecution. "There's obviously some kind of system error," he announced. "I'm Richard Torres, CEO of Pinnacle Technologies. I need immediate access to the executive floor." The security guard consulted his computer screen with exaggerated care before responding with practiced neutrality. "I'm sorry, sir, but your access privileges appear to have been revoked as of this morning. According to our updated protocols, you're now classified as unauthorized personnel requiring escort supervision for any building access." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Unauthorized personnel. The phrase seemed impossible, absurd, clearly some kind of administrative mistake that would be quickly resolved once he spoke to someone with actual authority. He demanded to speak with building management, insisted there had been some terrible error, and pulled out his phone to call his assistant for immediate clarification. Patricia answered on the first ring, her voice carrying an unusual tension that Richard was too agitated to notice. "Mr. Torres," she said carefully, "I was instructed to inform you that there have been some changes in company structure that require your immediate attention. You'll need to report to Conference Room A for an urgent meeting with the accounting department." Richard felt the first flutter of genuine anxiety as Patricia's words sank in. Changes in company structure wasn't language associated with minor administrative adjustments. Something significant was happening, something that apparently required emergency meetings and revoked access privileges. The security guard grudgingly agreed to escort Richard to the elevator, treating him like a potentially dangerous visitor rather than the man whose name appeared on the company letterhead. They rode to the executive floor in uncomfortable silence while Richard's mind raced through possible explanations for this surreal situation. Patricia met them at the elevator doors, her professional demeanor intact, but her eyes avoiding direct contact with Richard's increasingly frantic gaze. She led him down the familiar hallway toward Conference Room A, past offices where his employees watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to carefully concealed satisfaction. Inside the conference room, Harold Kim from accounting sat at the polished conference table surrounded by stacks of documents, his normally calm demeanor replaced by visible nervous energy. He gestured for Richard to take a seat across from him, then launched into an explanation that made no sense whatsoever. "Mr. Torres," Harold began, "we've discovered some significant discrepancies in our ownership documentation that require immediate clarification and legal resolution. It appears there may have been some confusion regarding the actual equity distribution and control structure of Pinnacle Technologies." Richard stared at Harold as if the accountant had begun speaking in ancient Latin. Discrepancies in ownership documentation was accounting speak for something far more serious than minor paperwork errors. Harold was essentially suggesting that someone didn't actually own what they thought they owned. The company's founding documents, Harold continued with growing discomfort, indicate that the majority stakeholder is listed as Castellano Holdings LLC, a limited liability company that apparently provided the initial funding for Pinnacle's establishment. The LLC maintains 51% equity ownership, which grants controlling interest in all major business decisions. Richard's confusion deepened as he processed Harold's words. Castellano Holdings LLC wasn't a name he recognized from their investor roster or partnership agreements. He had founded Pinnacle Technologies with his own vision and determination, funded initially through his wife's financial contribution and subsequently through venture capital rounds he had personally negotiated. Harold shuffled through the documents with increasing nervousness before locating the papers that would change Richard's understanding of his own life. According to these incorporation filings, Castellano Holdings LLC was established 6 months before Pinnacle Technologies, with Elena Castellano listed as primary officer and sole beneficiary of the limited liability company. The words crashed over Richard like ice water, each syllable carrying implications he couldn't fully comprehend. Elena Castellano, his wife's maiden name, a detail he had forgotten she had maintained for certain legal purposes. The woman he dismissed as financially incompetent apparently owned a controlling stake in his company through a legal entity he had never heard of. Harold continued his explanation with the mechanical precision of someone delivering devastating news he didn't want to understand himself. The initial funding for Pinnacle Technologies, approximately $2.3 million, was transferred from Castellano Holdings LLC in a transaction structured as equity investment rather than personal loan or gift. Richard felt reality shifting beneath him like unstable ground during an earthquake. Elena had contributed money to his startup, certainly, but he had assumed those funds represented her retirement savings and stock portfolio liquidation, money that became community property upon their marriage. The possibility that she had maintained separate corporate ownership had never occurred to him. Harold's voice grew increasingly strained as he reached the most critical information. All subsequent major business decisions, including venture capital agreements, client contracts, and expansion strategies, technically required approval from the majority stakeholder according to our corporate bylaws. There's no documentation indicating that Castellano Holdings LLC provided such approval for any of our operations over the past 5 years. The implications hit Richard with the force of a freight train. Every decision he had made as CEO, every contract he had signed, every expansion he had authorized, had apparently been conducted without legal authority from the actual controlling owner of Pinnacle Technologies. His entire career was built on a foundation of unauthorized corporate actions. Richard tried to access the company's primary financial accounts to verify Harold's claims, only to discover that his online banking privileges had been suspended pending resolution of ownership verification. The woman he had mocked for her lack of business acumen had somehow maneuvered him into a position where he couldn't even check his own company's bank balance. While Richard struggled to process this information, Patricia appeared in the conference room doorway with an expression of barely contained amazement. "Mr. Torres," she said carefully, "there's someone here to see you. Ms. Castellano has arrived and is requesting an immediate meeting with senior management." Richard looked up in confusion, expecting to see his wife appearing in the doorway with her typical apologetic demeanor and domestic concerns. Instead, Elena Castellano entered the conference room wearing a tailored charcoal business suit, carrying a leather briefcase, and moving with the confident authority of someone accustomed to commanding corporate environments. This wasn't the woman who had served wine at dinner parties or apologized for speaking during business conversations. This was Elena Castellano, corporate executive and majority stakeholder, arriving to assert control over assets she had apparently owned all along. Her transformation was so complete that Richard momentarily wondered if he was experiencing some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Elena took her seat at the head of the conference table with natural authority, opening her briefcase to reveal meticulously organized legal documents and financial records. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the crisp professionalism of someone conducting routine business rather than destroying her husband's entire sense of reality. "Richard," she said without preamble, "we need to discuss some serious irregularities in Pinnacle's operational management and your unauthorized use of corporate assets for personal expenses. I've been documenting various compliance violations and fiduciary breaches that require immediate correction." Elena spread documents across the table with systematic precision, each page representing months of careful documentation that Richard had never realized was occurring under his own roof. bank statements, expense reports, email communications, recorded phone conversations, all meticulously organized into a comprehensive record of corporate mismanagement and personal misconduct. Harold examined the documents with growing alarm, recognizing financial irregularities that could expose Pinnacle to serious legal liability and regulatory scrutiny. Elena's documentation revealed patterns of inappropriate expense allocation, unauthorized salary increases, and questionable client relationship management that painted Richard as fundamentally unfit for executive responsibility. Patricia returned to announce that board members were arriving for an emergency meeting that Richard hadn't been informed about, a gathering apparently called by Castellano Holdings LLC to address immediate governance concerns and leadership restructuring. The realization that Elena could convene board meetings while Richard couldn't even access his own office drove home the complete reversal of their power dynamic. Elena's briefcase revealed additional surprises as she produced recorded conversations between Richard and various business associates, audio evidence of him claiming credit for strategies developed by his wife, dismissing her contributions, and making derogatory comments about her intelligence and business acumen. Every humiliating moment Richard had inflicted was now documented evidence of his unfitness for corporate leadership. The woman Richard had dismissed as unemployed and incompetent had been methodically building a legal case against him for years, documenting every slight, every dismissal, every moment of condescension with the systematic thoroughness of someone planning comprehensive corporate restructuring. She had been playing chess while he played checkers, accumulating evidence while he accumulated arrogance. As board members began gathering in the adjacent conference room, Elena stood and straightened her jacket with the composed authority of someone about to claim their rightful position. She looked directly at Richard for the first time since entering the room, her expression carrying neither anger nor satisfaction, just the cool professionalism of someone conducting necessary business. "Richard," she said quietly, "you should understand that everything you think you know about our relationship, our finances, and your position in this company is about to change permanently. You've spent 5 years treating me like an incompetent housewife, while I've spent 5 years documenting why you're unfit to run the company I actually own." Elena gathered her documents and headed toward the door, pausing only to deliver her final comment with devastating calm. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes. You're welcome to attend, but you should know that you'll be attending as an employee under review, not as the CEO you never actually were." Richard sat alone in the conference room, staring at the evidence of his wife's systematic demolition of his assumed authority, finally understanding that the woman he had dismissed and humiliated possessed power he had never imagined and intelligence he had never recognized. The revenge fantasy he had never seen coming was about to reach its explosive conclusion, and he was completely powerless to stop it. The Pinnacle Technologies boardroom had never felt smaller or more suffocating than it did when Richard entered to find 8 people seated around the polished conference table, none of whom seemed particularly pleased to see him arrive. Elena sat at the head of the table in his usual chair, flanked by Margaret Chun, the corporate attorney whose midnight phone call had apparently triggered this corporate coup. Board members who had spent years deferring to Richard's leadership now avoided direct eye contact, their body language suggesting they possessed information that fundamentally altered his status within the company hierarchy. Marcus Webb and Stephen Chun, his supposed allies and business partners, sat rigidly in their chairs like defendants awaiting sentencing rather than executives planning strategy. Margaret Chun stood and introduced herself with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news to unprepared recipients. She explained that today's emergency meeting had been convened by Castellano Holdings LLC to address serious governance irregularities and unauthorized corporate management that threatened the company's legal standing and financial stability. Richard interrupted with growing desperation, insisting that he was the founder and chief executive officer of Pinnacle Technologies, that any meeting concerning company governance required his approval and participation as primary decision-maker. His voice carried the shrill edge of someone whose entire identity was crumbling in real time. Margaret Chin smiled with the patient tolerance of someone about to deliver devastating facts to someone unprepared to receive them. "Mr. Torres," she said, I think there may be some fundamental misunderstanding about your actual legal relationship to this company that we need to clarify before we can proceed with any meaningful discussion. She opened a thick folder and began distributing copies of incorporation documents, financial records, and legal filings that told a story completely different from the one Richard had believed for the past 5 years. The papers documented the establishment of Castellano Holdings LLC 6 months before Pinnacle Technologies even existed, a corporate entity created with Elena's family inheritance money and structured specifically for investment purposes. The initial funding for Pinnacle Technologies, Margaret explained, was provided through a formal equity investment by Castellano Holdings LLC in exchange for majority ownership stake. Elena Castellano, as primary officer of the LLC, maintained 51% controlling interest in all company operations from the moment of incorporation. Richard stared at the documents as if they were written in hieroglyphics, unable to process legal language that painted him as a minority partner in his own company. The incorporation papers clearly listed Castellano Holdings LLC as majority stakeholder, but he had no memory of negotiating such an arrangement or agreeing to surrender corporate control. Elena spoke for the first time since the meeting began, her voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone addressing subordinate employees rather than business partners. "Richard," she said, "you seem confused about the basic structure of this company. So let me clarify the situation using documentation you signed but apparently never bothered to read carefully." She began methodically walking through financial records that showed how Richard's startup dream had been funded entirely through Elena's family money, wealth she had inherited from her grandmother's real estate investments and carefully managed through sophisticated investment strategies. The $2.3 million that launched Pinnacle Technologies had never been community property or joint marital assets. Elena explained how she had structured the investment as equity purchase rather than loan or gift specifically to maintain legal control over corporate operations and protect her inheritance from potential business failures. Richard had signed documents agreeing to these terms, but his signature appeared beside legal language he had clearly never understood or investigated. The revelation that Elena came from significant family wealth contradicted everything Richard had believed about their relationship dynamics. He had assumed she was dependent on his success for financial security, never realizing that she possessed independent resources that dwarfed his entire net worth. Her family's real estate portfolio alone was worth more than Pinnacle Technologies' current market valuation. Margaret Chin continued the devastating presentation by revealing that every major business decision Richard had made over the past 5 years had been conducted without proper authorization from the majority stakeholder. Venture capital agreements, client contracts, expansion strategies, personnel hiring, even Richard's own salary increases had all violated corporate governance protocols and potentially exposed the company to serious legal liability. Elena's briefcase revealed additional surprises as she produced comprehensive documentation of Richard's financial mismanagement and inappropriate use of corporate resources. Expense reports showed personal purchases charged to company accounts, salary adjustments that exceeded his authorized compensation package, and entertainment expenses that had no legitimate business justification. The board members examined Elena's evidence with growing alarm, recognizing patterns of corporate misconduct that could trigger regulatory investigation and criminal prosecution. Richard's unauthorized actions hadn't just violated company policy, they had potentially constituted embezzlement and fiduciary breach that exposed every board member to legal liability. Marcus Webb, Richard's supposed ally, was the first to break ranks and acknowledge the severity of the situation. Based on this documentation, he said grimly, "We're looking at potential SEC violations, tax fraud, and criminal misappropriation of corporate assets. The board needs to take immediate action to limit our exposure and demonstrate good faith cooperation with proper governance protocols." Richard's desperate attempts to assert his authority fell on increasingly deaf ears as board members absorbed the magnitude of Elena's revelations. His claims of executive privilege and foundational ownership were systematically dismantled by legal documents bearing his own signature, contracts he had signed without understanding their implications. Elena's most devastating evidence came in the form of recorded conversations where Richard had explicitly acknowledged her contributions to company strategy while simultaneously dismissing her capabilities to business associates. Audio recordings captured him admitting that Elena developed their client retention strategies, managed major account relationships, and created the financial models that secured their venture capital funding. The recordings revealed Richard's private acknowledgement of his dependence on Elena's work contrasted sharply with his public dismissal of her intelligence and business acumen. Board members listened with visible discomfort as Richard's voice described Elena as the real brains behind Pinnacle's success, admissions he had apparently forgotten making during unguarded moments. Margaret Chen presented additional evidence of Richard's verbal and emotional abuse toward Elena, documented through email communications, recorded phone calls, and witness statements from company employees who had observed his condescending treatment of his wife during business meetings and social events. Patricia, Richard's assistant, provided particularly damaging testimony about his pattern of taking credit for work Elena performed, his instructions to exclude her from business communications, and his explicit directions to treat her as a decorative spouse rather than a business contributor. Her detailed notes painted a picture of systematic humiliation and professional marginalization. Elena announced her decision to assume immediate control as chief executive officer, explaining that Castellano Holdings LLC was exercising its majority ownership rights to restructure company leadership and implement proper governance protocols. Richard's position would be subject to comprehensive review pending investigation of his unauthorized actions and financial misconduct. The board voted unanimously to support Elena's leadership transition and authorize immediate implementation of new management structures. Richard's voting rights as minority shareholder were insufficient to oppose any decisions supported by Elena's controlling interest, leaving him completely powerless to prevent his own removal from corporate authority. Elena's transformation was complete as she began issuing executive directives with the confident authority of someone who had been preparing for this moment for years. Her instructions were precise, comprehensive, and delivered with the professional competence Richard had spent 5 years refusing to recognize or acknowledge. Company employees who had witnessed Richard's treatment of Elena began gathering outside the boardroom as news of the leadership change spread through the office. Their expressions ranged from amazement to satisfaction as they absorbed the reality that the woman he had dismissed and humiliated now controlled his professional fate. Richard's final desperate argument that Elena had somehow tricked or manipulated him into signing documents he didn't understand was met with recordings of him bragging about his sophisticated business acumen and superior understanding of corporate strategy. His own words undermined any claim of incompetence or deception. Margaret Chen concluded the meeting by explaining that Richard's employment status would be determined through formal review process that would evaluate his performance, conduct, and fitness for continued association with Pinnacle Technologies. The irony was profound that the man who had threatened to fire his wife for incompetence now faced unemployment evaluation by the woman he had systematically undermined. Elena gathered her documents with the composed authority of someone who had just completed necessary but unpleasant business. She looked directly at Richard for the first time during the meeting, her expression carrying neither triumph nor vindictiveness, just the cool professionalism of someone who had finally claimed their rightful position. The meeting ended with Elena assuming immediate executive authority while Richard sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that the woman he had dismissed as an unemployed housewife possessed not only superior intelligence and business acumen, but also the legal power to destroy everything he had believed he built. As board members filed out of the room, several stopped to congratulate Elena on her comprehensive preparation and professional handling of an obviously difficult situation. Their respect and deference toward her stood in sharp contrast to the dismissive treatment Richard had always encouraged them to show his wife. Richard remained alone in the boardroom, staring at legal documents that proved his entire sense of identity had been built on fundamental misunderstanding of his own situation. The revenge he had never seen coming was now complete, delivered with surgical precision by the woman whose intelligence he had spent years denying and whose power he had never bothered to investigate. Elena had played the ultimate long game, allowing Richard to humiliate and dismiss her while systematically documenting his incompetence and preparing for the moment when she would reveal her true position and claim her rightful authority. The unemployed housewife had just fired the CEO, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop her. Elena's first act as chief executive officer was delivered with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years planning this exact moment. She informed Richard that his employment with Pinnacle Technologies was terminated immediately for cause, specifically citing unauthorized financial transactions, misrepresentation of corporate authority, and conduct detrimental to company interests. The termination paperwork had been prepared weeks in advance, Margaret Chin explained, as Elena had anticipated this outcome once Richard's pattern of misconduct was fully documented and presented to the board. Every legal requirement had been satisfied, every procedural step completed, leaving Richard with no grounds for appeal or recourse. Patricia appeared in the boardroom doorway carrying a cardboard box and security escort, the universal symbols of corporate termination that Richard had never imagined would apply to someone of his stature and importance. His personal items from the executive office were already packed, his computer access had been revoked, and his parking space had been reassigned to Elena. The company car keys were collected along with Richard's corporate credit cards, his building access badge, and his company-issued mobile phone. Each item represented another connection severed, another symbol of authority stripped away, another reminder that his corporate identity had been completely erased in the span of 2 hours. Elena announced that Pinnacle's new chief financial officer would conduct a comprehensive audit of all financial transactions conducted under Richard's unauthorized management, with particular attention to personal expenses charged to corporate accounts and salary payments that exceeded his legitimate compensation package. The prospect of financial investigation added potential criminal liability to Richard's growing list of problems. Richard discovered that his access to their joint banking accounts had been suspended pending legal review of asset ownership and community property determination. The accounts he had always assumed were under his control had apparently been managed by Elena through financial powers of attorney he had signed but never fully understood. Elena produced additional documentation showing that their Malibu home, the symbol of Richard's success and status, was titled solely in her name through inheritance from her grandmother's estate. The house he had believed they owned together was actually Elena's separate property, purchased years before their marriage and maintained through her family trust fund. The revelation that Elena's family possessed generational wealth that dwarfed anything Richard had ever achieved added another layer of humiliation to his rapidly deteriorating situation. The woman he had dismissed as financially dependent was actually supporting their lifestyle through inheritance money that made his corporate salary irrelevant to their household economics. Margaret Chun explained that Elena had maintained detailed financial records documenting every dollar of community income versus separate property assets, creating clear legal separation that protected her inheritance from any claims Richard might attempt to make during divorce proceedings that now seemed inevitable. Richard's desperate attempts to contact business associates for support or alternative employment opportunities met with polite but firm rejection as news of his termination and the circumstances surrounding Elena's takeover spread through Los Angeles business networks. His professional reputation had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Jonathan Morrison's office issued a statement that afternoon announcing their decision to proceed with contract negotiations exclusively with Elena Castellano as Chief Executive Officer of Pinnacle Technologies, expressing confidence in her leadership and strategic vision while making no mention of Richard's previous involvement with their business relationship. The most devastating blow came when Richard attempted to contact potential investors about founding a new company, only to discover that Elena had been proactive in sharing documentation of his misconduct with venture capital firms throughout the region. His burning of bridges was now comprehensive and seemingly permanent. Elena's systematic dismantling of Richard's life extended beyond corporate and financial destruction to include social and professional isolation that left him with no allies, no resources, and no realistic path forward. She had anticipated every possible avenue of recovery and methodically closed each one through legal action and strategic communication. The recorded conversations Elena had been collecting for years proved invaluable for demonstrating Richard's pattern of verbal abuse, professional theft, and psychological manipulation to anyone who might consider offering him employment or support. His own words became the most powerful evidence against his character and competence. Richard's attempts to claim that Elena had somehow deceived or manipulated him were undermined by extensive documentation of his arrogant dismissal of her intelligence and his confident assertions of superior business acumen. The evidence painted him as someone too proud and condescending to recognize threats to his position. Elena's final conversation with Richard took place in the empty boardroom after security had escorted him through the building for the last time. Her demeanor remained professionally composed, showing neither satisfaction nor vindictiveness, just the cool efficiency of someone completing necessary business tasks. "Richard," she said quietly, "I want you to understand that everything that happened today was the direct result of choices you made over the past 5 years. You had countless opportunities to treat me with respect, acknowledge my contributions, and recognize my capabilities. Instead, you chose humiliation, dismissal, and systematic undermining of my worth and intelligence." She continued with devastating calm, explaining that his termination and financial ruin weren't acts of revenge, but natural consequences of his own actions and attitudes. The woman he had dismissed as incompetent had simply documented his incompetence more thoroughly than he had recognized hers. Elena informed Richard that divorce papers would be filed within the week, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting dissolution of their marriage with clear separation of assets based on documentation she had been preparing for years. He would receive nothing beyond what California law required for community property, which would amount to virtually nothing given Elena's careful asset protection strategies. The security escort returned to inform Elena that Richard's vehicle had been removed from company property and that building access protocols had been updated to prevent any unauthorized return visits. His transformation from corporate executive to unemployed outsider was now complete and irreversible. Richard left the Pinnacle Technologies building for the final time, carrying his cardboard box of personal items and facing a future where the woman he had spent years dismissing and humiliating now controlled every aspect of his former life. The revenge fantasy he had never seen coming had reached its devastating conclusion. Elena remained in the boardroom, already focused on the executive responsibilities she had been preparing for during 5 years of invisible labor and systematic documentation. Her transformation from submissive housewife to corporate leader was complete, and she was finally free to exercise the intelligence and capabilities that Richard had spent so long refusing to acknowledge. The unemployed housewife had just destroyed the career of the man who had mocked her unemployed status, using legal powers he had never bothered to investigate and intelligence he had never respected. His complete destruction had been accomplished through his own arrogance and systematic underestimation of the woman whose capabilities he had refused to recognize until it was far too late to matter. 6 months after the boardroom confrontation that destroyed Richard's life, Elena Castellano stood behind the podium at the Beverly Hills Business Excellence Awards, delivering the keynote address to an audience of Los Angeles's most successful entrepreneurs and corporate leaders. Her transformation from invisible housewife to recognized business authority was now complete and publicly acknowledged. Pinnacle Technologies had achieved record quarterly profits under Elena's leadership, securing 3 major government contracts and expanding into international markets that Richard had never possessed the vision or competence to pursue. Her strategic initiatives had increased company valuation by 40% while establishing Pinnacle as a dominant force in their sector. The Morrison Holdings contract, which Richard had nearly destroyed through mathematical incompetence, had evolved into a comprehensive partnership worth $26 million annually. Elena's sophisticated understanding of federal compliance requirements and regulatory frameworks had impressed Morrison executives who now considered Pinnacle their primary technology partner. Forbes magazine had featured Elena on their cover as one of America's most innovative business leaders, with a comprehensive article exploring how women's contributions to startup success often remain invisible until circumstances force recognition of their fundamental importance to corporate operations and strategic development. Richard Torres, meanwhile, had spent the past 6 months working data entry for a small accounting firm in Riverside, His professional reputation so thoroughly destroyed that even entry-level positions required extensive explanation of his employment gap and termination circumstances. The tech industry had effectively blacklisted him based on documented evidence of financial misconduct and corporate mismanagement. His attempts to rebuild through networking and professional relationships had failed completely, as Elena's strategic sharing of his recorded admissions and documented misconduct had reached every relevant business circle in Southern California. No one wanted to risk association with someone whose own words revealed such fundamental character defects. Elena's keynote address focused on recognizing and valuing invisible labor that women perform in supporting entrepreneurial ventures, often without credit or compensation. While male partners receive recognition for achievements that would have been impossible without systematic feminine contribution to business development and strategic planning. The audience listened with rapt attention as Elena described patterns of professional marginalization that resonated with women throughout the business community, stories of intelligence dismissed, contributions appropriated, and capabilities systematically underestimated by male colleagues who benefited from work they never acknowledged. During the networking reception following her presentation, Elena was approached by dozens of women seeking advice about documenting their contributions, protecting their interests, and establishing legal frameworks that would prevent exploitation of their intellectual and professional labor in male-dominated business environments. Elena had quietly begun mentoring women in similar situations, providing legal guidance and strategic advice for protecting assets, documenting misconduct, and establishing independent financial security that couldn't be controlled or threatened by dismissive partners who underestimated feminine intelligence and capability. The most dramatic moment of the evening occurred when Richard appeared at the reception, having apparently convinced security that he belonged among the successful business leaders celebrating entrepreneurial achievement. His cheap suit and desperate demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the confident executives surrounding Elena's networking circle. Richard approached Elena with the pleading expression of someone whose entire world had collapsed and who possessed no remaining options for recovery or redemption. His voice carried the broken quality of someone who had finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculations and the permanence of his destruction. "Elena," he said quietly, his words barely audible above the reception conversation, "I understand now what I did wrong. I see how much you contributed and how badly I treated your intelligence. Is there any possibility of reconciliation or second chances? I've lost everything, and I don't know how to rebuild my life." Elena regarded Richard with the calm authority of someone who had moved far beyond anger into professional indifference. Her response was delivered with the same composed efficiency she brought to corporate negotiations, neither cruel nor kind, simply factual and final. "Richard," she replied, "the consequences you're experiencing aren't punishment for past behavior. They're natural results of choices you made consistently over years of marriage and business partnership. You had countless opportunities to recognize my capabilities, respect my contributions, and treat me as an equal partner rather than a decorative accessory." She continued with devastating clarity, explaining that his current situation resulted from systematic documentation of his actual competence level versus his assumed authority, revealing fundamental gaps between his self-perception and objective reality that made him unsuitable for executive responsibility or trustworthy partnership. Elena's final words to Richard carried the weight of moral instruction rather than personal vindictiveness. "The problem wasn't that you underestimated me," she said. "The problem is that you never bothered to look closely enough to make accurate assessments. You saw what you wanted to see and ignored evidence that contradicted your assumptions about intelligence, capability, and worth." Richard walked away from the reception alone, his shoulders slumped with the permanent defeat of someone who had gambled everything on arrogance and lost completely. His transformation from successful executive to unemployed outcast served as visible reminder that dismissing intelligence based on prejudice carries devastating consequences when reality eventually asserts itself. Elena returned to her conversation with fellow business leaders, already focused on future strategic initiatives and expansion opportunities that would cement Pinnacle's position as industry innovator. Her story had become inspiration for women throughout the business community who recognized similar patterns of underestimation and systematic dismissal in their own professional lives. The revenge fantasy that Richard had never seen coming was now complete, delivered with surgical precision through legal documentation, strategic planning, and systematic collection of evidence that revealed his fundamental unfitness for authority he had never legitimately possessed. Has a story like this ever resonated with your own experiences in relationships or business partnerships? Have you witnessed situations where someone's true capabilities were hidden or underestimated until circumstances forced recognition? Share your thoughts in the comments about how power dynamics can shift when hidden truths are finally revealed. Elena's triumph represented more than personal vindication. It demonstrated how systematic documentation, legal preparation, and strategic patience could overcome even entrenched patterns of dismissal and professional marginalization. The unemployed housewife had become corporate leader, while the arrogant executive had discovered the true cost of underestimating feminine intelligence and capability. The moral lesson was clear and devastating. Respect the intelligence of your partners, acknowledge their contributions, and never assume that quiet competence represents weakness or incompetence. Some people are simply waiting for the right moment to reveal exactly how much power they actually possess.